Hello, everyone. We're going to get tonight's program started. And thank you for joining us for this year's If It Wasn't for the Women virtual panel. My name is Victoria McCraven, and I am the 2020-2021 Romare Bearden Graduate Museum Fellow. Dating back to 2011, previous Bearden Fellows have hosted the If It Wasn't for the Women panel, which in its 10th year continues to celebrate women of color in the arts. In designing this year's theme, Ancestral Threads, I look to rising interest in contemporary art and works in the museum's collection, landing on fiber art as the area of focus for this year's program. You might be wondering, what is fiber art? Fiber art is an umbrella term used to describe art made of natural or synthetic fibers, elevating what was seen as craft to fine art. This can include textiles, quilts, and even sculpture. The title Ancestral Threads seeks to acknowledge the generational and often matrilineal nature of fiber art in the first word ancestral, but also its materiality in the second word threads. In beginning to plan this event, I was immediately drawn to a piece called Copper Strata by artist Mary Giles, currently in Decorative Arts Gallery 131. Mary Giles worked locally here in St. Louis, having a long and successful career. She sadly passed in 2018, but I had the opportunity to speak directly with her widower, Jim Harris, about her work. Giles was born in 1944 and raised in Minnesota. Her father was a cabinet maker, and her mother was an avid knitter and quilter. She incorporated basket making techniques into her work, and she was often inspired by the natural world. She experimented with vessel shaped sculptures and tried to distance them from function, describing herself as a fiber sculptor. In speaking with Mr. Harris about copper strata in the museum's collection, he mentioned the piece is unique because it's one of the only works in which Mary blended metal and fiber materials in this way. She used a torch to achieve the color gradation seen here. Having spoken with Mr. Harris, I continued learning more about fiber art here in St. Louis, but also more broadly. In addition to SLAM's focus on local artists, the museum's collection also includes fiber works of national and international recognition. One of the broadly recognized works in the museum's collection is Lucy Mingo's Pine Burr quilt. Mingo comes from a small Black American community in Alabama known as Gee's Bend, which is recognized for its quilt making. Descending from several generations of quilt makers, Lucy Mingo excelled at complex patterning and became one of Gee's Bend's leading spokespeople during the civil rights era. Another work that shows the strength of fiber art within the museum's collection is Joe Baker's Birthday by Faith Ringgold, which is currently on view in Gallery 248. Joe Baker's Birthday came to the St. Louis Art Museum in 1944 as part of the Currents 57 exhibition. Centrally portrayed is entertainer Josephine Baker. Born in St. Louis in 1906, Baker went on to have a successful international career as an entertainer and dancer in Europe, making her debut in Paris in 1925 at the age of just 19. The work is special for its St. Louis connections, given the depiction of Josephine Baker, but also for its importance as part of Faith Ringgold's four-work series, French Collection Part 2. The series features a fictional Black American artist, William Marie Simon, living in France in the 1920s. William Marie Simon, throughout the series, encounters important European artists as well as influential Black American women. As you can see on the right-hand side, there's a reference to Matisse's Harmony in Red, and you can pretty recognizably see Faith Ringgold's story quilt style. The work features a central painted canvas with a fictional narrative told in the panels surrounding it. In the work, she incorporates themes of race and gender, and the fictional character starts by writing to her Aunt Melissa, describing a portrait she began of Josephine Baker on her birthday. She talks of her admiration for Baker, describes meeting her for the first time in Paris, but later Ringgold breaks from this imaginary narrative she has constructed, reminding us that as a Black woman, Baker would not be appreciated for her talent in the United States. In addition to thinking of works in the museum's collection and also the contemporary artists that we're going to hear from today, It was also important to incorporate historical narratives of fiber art, which relate directly to St. Louis. An important but often forgotten figure within the narrative of St. Louis history is Elizabeth Keckley. Now, for the historians in the room, Keckley is spelled Keckley or Keckly. So if you want to do more research on her, you can find her with both of those spellings. But there's so much on her, so I really urge you to go and find out more. But she was born in 1818 in Virginia, and she was enslaved by the Burwell family. Her mother, Agnes Hobbs, taught Elizabeth to sew, and at the age of 14, she was sent to live in North Carolina. There, she endured extreme physical and sexual abuse. In 1842, she returned to Virginia before the family eventually moved to St. Louis in 1847 in search of better financial opportunities. On arriving in St. Louis, Keckley became a seamstress, earning money to support her young son George, herself, and her enslavers. And in 1855, with the help of a local patroness, she raised enough money to buy her and her son George's freedom. As you can see here, her emancipation papers that are actually at the Missouri Historical Society. And she bought her freedom and that of George for $1,200, or $36,000 in today's money. She stayed in St. Louis for another 5 years to pay off those debts to her patroness, and then she moved to Washington, D.C. in 1860. And through a connection with a former patroness, she was eventually hired as Mary Todd Lincoln's personal seamstress. So Keckley was very close to the White House, and you can see here is a dress that was sewn and worn for the Washington winter social season from 1861 to 1862. This work is currently at the Smithsonian. And Mary Todd Lincoln and Elizabeth Keckley formed a close relationship. And after the assassination of President Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln was in a lot of debt, and she was involved in a scandal regarding her finances. And during this time, Elizabeth Keckley was accused of selling off or donating some of her possessions without Mary Todd Lincoln's permission. And to try to salvage her character, she wrote an 1868 memoir called Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House. This memoir wasn't very well received because people thought it said too much about Lincoln's personal life. But Keckley continued, to persist. And so she went and taught at Wilberforce University's Department of Sewing and Domestic Science Arts. And she later returned to Washington and in 1907 died at the age of 89. And so now, after we've heard that some of these works in the museum's collection and also the history of artists such as Elizabeth Keckley, without further ado, I would please to introduce the main event for tonight, 3 contemporary artists working in fiber art. We have a really talented panel of artists this evening who will each give a brief presentation about their work. Please hold your questions for the Q&A session at the end of the program, and I really do hope you enjoy. We are going to begin by hearing from artist Edna Patterson Petty. Edna J. Patterson Petty is a lifelong resident of East St. Louis, Illinois. She's a graduate of SIU Edwardsville with a BFA in studio art, an MFA in textile arts, and an MA in art therapy. Although Patterson Petty is better known for her fabric art quilts, she also enjoys creating assemblage art using a variety of found and discarded objects. Patterson Petty believes in using her intuition to guide the direction of her work and enrich her creativity. So I would like to introduce Edna Patterson Petty.
Hi, everyone. As she said, I'm Edna Patterson Petty, and I am from East St. Louis, Illinois, and I'm a graduate of SIU Edwardsville. I have always enjoyed creating, even when I didn't know what that word meant. I know that I enjoyed drawing in the dirt or looking up in the sky and seeing images of seeing the clouds that remind me of different images. Sometimes I saw faces, sometimes I saw animals, I saw an array of things. I lived in my own world. Even though I was the oldest of 7 children, I felt like I was the only child because I was so different from my siblings. I enjoyed creating, whereas they enjoyed a lot of the other things that didn't bring me joy. I was sexually abused very early in my life. I was about 11 years old. And so art became, like I said, before I knew what the word art meant, I still knew that I enjoyed creating things. And so I started doing different things that brought me joy. And that was my solace. That was the thing that brought joy to me and gave me a voice, because I was afraid to use my own voice. So I would disappear into my own world of creativity. This first picture that's being shown, if it wasn't for the women, really means a lot to me, because not only does it have different women over the years that have done things in politics or activism and all of that. Even we have an image of Jackie Joyner Kersee there. Also, there's a picture of my mom and my grandmother that's also within this design. And I used the centerpiece, a shape of a woman, that I used in a couple of other pieces. The way this piece came to be is I created a piece about President Obama when he became the 44th president. And all of the quilts have the same background, the orange and rustic shape color of the silk fabric, which was an old drape that I broke down and created a certain size that I could create these designs out of. And because I created all the other, it was 7 quilts included, but 6 of the quilts were about him. And then I wanted something about women, because if it wasn't for the women, he wouldn't even be who he is or where he is, or wouldn't even have been born. So this piece resonates well with me. The way I laid the images, these are photo images that I printed onto fabric and then superimposed them onto the background. I have always enjoyed putting puzzles together. And so to me, this was just like a big puzzle being put together. And as I stated earlier, I've been sexually abused. So to me, it was like putting myself back together in the best way that I knew how. We can go to the next slide. This is Beloved. And this was based on the movie that Oprah was in, and the story by Toni Morrison, Beloved. And so the tree in the design represents the scarring on the back of the slaves as they were, when they were beaten. The black hands represent the grandmother that stated you should use your hands, be thankful for your hands, because you can do a lot of great things with your hands. And then the image of the woman with the child represents the star of the movie, Oprah's character. And then the image of the baby crawling is the baby that was killed, and she's crawling in her own blood, and she was like a ghost and everything. And so the quilt represents the last thing that the older woman in the movie had to cover her with. She loved her bright quilt, and she found joy in creating that. And then in the upper left-hand corner is a shape of a heart. And that just represents when the character, Oprah's character, had to leave her home, even though it was not a loving home, it was the only home that she knew of. And so that represents that, and the only family that she knew from that time. Okay, the next one. This means a lot to me because as a therapist, I work with a lot of young women, especially women of color, young adults as well as older adults, who just didn't have a good feeling about themselves. They did not like either their color, their shape, their size, their hair. They liked nothing about themselves. And so this piece came from that. It's about starting a new day. Be true to yourself. Love the skin that you're in. And again, I use pieces of discarded fabric to create my pieces. I very seldom would buy a whole piece of fabric and break it down into pieces. I would always use recycled clothing. And that's something that I picked up from my mother. she made the bed quilts for our family, and it was always made out of our old clothing. She would take our old blouses, skirts, whatever, and then she would have me help her at that time cut the pieces up and then discard the zippers and the buttons and all of that. And that's where our bed quilt came from. And it was a good talking point because sometimes on a cold winter night, we were sitting wrapped up in a quilt, eating a bowl of oatmeal and buttered toast and talking about the pieces in the quilt, like recognizing your old skirt or your old blouse or something like that. So it was always sort of a fun thing to do. It was just a joy knowing how to sew. Now my mother, as I said, she made quilts, but she made them by hand. She didn't know how to use a sewing machine. So once I was old enough and I learned how to sew on the sewing machine, which I learned in high school, I was able to then teach her how to use a sewing machine. And that kind of sped up her work in terms of always sewing by hand. So I followed in her footsteps. Like I said, she made quilts, but my grandmother, who died when I was 2, so I didn't get a chance to know her, but she would make quilts, and she also made clothing. My mom told me that she could look at a pattern or look at a design of a piece and recreate it without having that pattern to follow. And so I think that I got my talent from her. A lot of times people say who they were most influenced by in terms of becoming an artist. I was very embarrassed when I was younger because I didn't have anybody that I was influenced by as far as an artist. I didn't know of anyone, but my mother was my biggest influence because of what she did. And I remember when I first went to college, which was at the age of 34, I was the mother of 4 children, and I was in a bad marriage. And the instructor asked me, who was I influenced by? And I said, I wasn't influenced by anybody in particular except for my mom. And so she said that couldn't be true. So that made me embarrassed. Even though I was a grown woman, I was still embarrassed by the way that she had talked to me and the things that she said. So then I chose Faith Ringgold to say that she influenced me, when in reality, I did not know about Faith Ringgold until I just started doing some research and saw work of hers. And then I said, well, this looks the closest to what I do. So therefore, I'll say that she influenced me. But like I said, it was actually my mom that influenced me more than anyone. And I'm really glad that I learned that way, because that way I could rely on something that I did, something that was coming right from me. It wasn't coming from, trying to imitate someone else's work and all of that. And like I said before, loving to put puzzles together, and to create puzzles, this helped me in putting myself back together. It's my version of a blog that they would use today. I told my story through the arts. Okay, next. In this piece, it was really fun to put together because someone gave me a pile of fabric scraps. And I took the scraps to create this quilt, and I didn't shape any of the scraps. They are just the way they were given to me in this particular quilt. And I beat it into submission, more or less, by constantly sewing and reinforcing the fabric to the background. And I love to listen to music as I work. So I had jazz playing in the background, and I worked on this quilt. And you can't see it very well in this photo, but there's rows and rows and rows of stitching that holds the piece together. And it was such a joy to create, because I love the outcome of when I work on something. I love the fact that I follow my own intuition, my own guide, and I just feel really good about it. And I always enjoy if someone enjoy what I do, because I know I put a lot of myself into it. I put a lot of love into it. And so at this point in my life, I have taken a little bit of a break from sewing. I am creating a lot of mosaics, but I'm doing that within my home. One thing I decided that I know when it's my time to leave this earth, I wanted an art house. I wanted something that someone can see, can come and visit and that type of thing. So I've talked to my daughter about all of that. I have not given up quilting, but I just wanted to take a little bit of a break from it and do some other things that I enjoy. Next, excuse me. This piece is about people that have passed on that I knew. And it was, as you can see, spirits seen and unseen. And in the center of the piece, you see fabric looped onto each other. And you think about the game, The Barrel of Monkeys, how the monkeys' tails would hook to the other little images. And so that's what this is about. And in the blue in the background represents water, but rather than the water washing down, the water is rushing up, because at the bottom, you can see a jug that's turned on its side and the water is spilling from it. And the black lines represent the crossroads, because we all at some point, as they say, we're 6 degrees from separation. And that's what the black lines, excuse me, represent. And the blue is the netting. And it, to me, it most resembled water. And I was able to just dye the color that it is. And in the back is a overlay of fabric, kind of like a fabric collage. Next. This is about Katherine Dunham, and I call it Lady D. And the background of the fabric is tie-dye, because I used to do quite a bit of dyeing. And again, I like to kind of put my own spin on fabric rather than, like I said, just buy yardage and cut it up to the pieces that I want. And there's, other than the center picture of her, there's 3 other pictures on here. That's a scene of her with someone that she was starring with in one of the movies that she was in. And so I wanted to tell a story about her, and she was able to, this is an older piece, and she saw the mock-up for it prior to her death. She didn't see the actual piece. But again, I try to find ways of telling a story for myself and what it means to me. And Miss Dunham meant an awful lot to me, because in coming to East St. Louis, working with some of the young gang members and teaching them the dance, and just bringing some notoriety to East St. Louis, I wanted to do my best to honor her in the only way that I knew how, and that was to sew something and create it in the beautiful image of her. Okay, next. This is called Midnight Moves. And this is based on just the sexual intimacy within yourself, not always sex about a man and a woman, but just being aware of who you are, what you are, and whose you are. And that's how this piece came to be. And again, like music playing in the background, the overlay of fabric, the continuation of the stitches, because I followed the lines in the outer border where you can see like lighter blue and darker blue. I reinforced all of that with constant sewing, just sewing over those lines back and forth to give it a lot more structure. And then I created the inner piece. And rather than giving the person, the woman, a face, I just wanted to have an image, a silhouette more or less, and just have it in black, just to show the sexuality, but not necessarily giving it a particular identity with the face and all of that. Next. This is about finding myself. This is about spirit. This is about getting in touch with who I am. And I've been on a spiritual journey for a while. And there's a third eye on the forehead. And that's kind of seeing what life is all about, getting to know who I am, because as a person that was sexually abused, I lost my identity. I lost who I was. I didn't think I was worthy to be saved. I didn't think I was worthy of doing anything or becoming anything, because at the time that I was sexually abused, nothing was done about it. The person that abused me was an uncle within my family, and he was not, nothing happened to him. No one said anything to him, to my knowledge. No one did anything to him, and I was punished for what he had done to me. And so therefore I wore that like a glove. I just had very little good feelings about myself. And even when I was old enough to go to college, I still did not feel good about myself. I had to learn how to get to know who I was as a person. Even when I became a mom and a wife and a mom, that was a very hard thing for me, because I did not have a good feeling about myself. I was very insecure. So therefore, the marriage was not all that it should have been, because I did not know how to stick up for myself or speak up for myself or any of that. So I lost myself in all of the things that had happened to me from the past, and I hid behind my art. To some people, art is a way of just self-expression. Also, they're doing it maybe for a particular cause, or they found someone that they enjoyed studying, and then they created art based on that feeling from that. But again, my art was my survival. It was how I handle life. It's how I could find a voice for myself. It's how I just learn to live, learn to just find worthiness within myself. And I'm still doing that every day. It's not an easy thing. And depression comes and goes with the way that things have happened. But in becoming a therapist, I used what happened to me as a teaching tool in talking to a lot of young women, a lot of older women as well. There's been lots of people that have gone through similar situations, and they found it easier to share that information when I was able to share my life with them. And I think this will be the last image coming up, maybe. Next. Oh no, it's one more after that. This is pondering. This is about the thoughts that come into your head, the things that you want to do, the choices that you want to make, the places you want to go. You're just pondering that. What can I do? What should I do? And all of that. And it's made out of beads and buttons and a little bit of paint. And the corn that's in the four corners just represent nurturing, growth, and all of that. And even the rod that she's leaning on is hand beaded, and the colander, or I'm not sure the right name for it, but where she's churning the butter in there or breaking down wheat, that's all hand beaded as well. But it's just, like I said, it's just giving thought to me as a woman, me as a person, me as an artist, giving life to all of that. Next. And I think this is the last piece. This piece is about balancing your chakras, being attuned, coming into your own, finding self-worth, finding self-love, and being able to stand in your own shadow and not be afraid of speaking up, not being afraid to stand up and tell people, I am worthy. I am a child of God. I have a right to be here. I have a right to be wherever it is that I am. And so that's how that piece came to be. All of the pieces that have been shown here tonight represent me. It represents how I feel about me. And if it relates to someone else, I'm always happy for that. But first and foremost, it was my way of getting in touch with who I am. Thank you.
Thank you, Edna, so much for sharing your work and your practice. And if you have any questions for Edna, at the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A box. So you can just place your questions there, and then we'll address those questions in the Q&A session at the end of this program.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And next, I would like to introduce the next artist for this evening's program, Song Watkins Park. Song Watkins Park was born in Jingwon, South Korea. She received her BFA in drawing and painting with honors at the University of Iowa and received her MFA in visual arts at the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts, Washington University in St. Louis. Currently, she is an adjunct faculty member at St. Louis Community College and lives in St. Louis, Missouri. Thank you, Song, and welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm Song. I am an interdisciplinary artist based in St. Louis. So I'm very excited to share some of my fiber artworks and my art practice with you tonight. Yeah, let's look at the work. So this is a work called Camouflage. I hope everyone got the joke. It's a cat in camouflage. It's a portrait of my cat. If you look at the work formally, there are two big components. One is a painting in the middle, and there are fabric pieces sewn together. It kind of frames the painting or kind of decorates the painting. It is one of my earliest work of the series. And if you look at the date in the below of the image, it says 2019. So it's pretty new. I'm pretty new to this fiber artwork. I started my artistic career as a painter, and to share a little bit about how I got into fiber art, I think it started when I was in grad school at WashU. I'm thinking now, I think that 2 years was very, very important years for me as an artist, because that was a time I started to realize my experiences, my history, my identity cannot be separated from my work. That was the time I started to realize that, and whether I intended or not. And I was looking at my work, and I was talking about lots of my gender identity in my works. So I felt like I need to learn about how other female artists are using their unique gestures to talk about their gender identity in their artwork. So my biggest inspiration during the time was Carolee Schneemann. And since I was starting as a painter, 20th century abstract expressionism women artists like Helen Frankenthaler, Lee Krasner, Joan Mitchell were my biggest inspiration. And I think that leads me to get into interest in work like a craft, some so-called women's work. And I think that was about time I graduated the school. And I had this opportunity to work at local fabric store after I graduate. I worked there about a year. So it was a very like natural transition for me to get into the fabric. I don't know if you ever been to fabric store. It's like, I don't know, for me as a girl who grew up with like Disney princess movie and stuff, it was like a Sleeping Beauties, like where like birds are carrying like fabrics. It's that kind of like moment, you know. I really enjoy working in the environment. So that's how I really fell in love with fabrics at first, and I didn't have any knowledge about sewing, but I learned a little bit from my coworkers, and my customers there always share about how they do their project and stuff. And to be honest, mostly from the YouTube. And this is what I'm working on, and I'm still very much learning. So next, please. Okay, so this work is called Peach Fuzz. This is a portrait of my husband. So I want to talk about a little bit about my subject matter in this series. So this specific portrait, I still remember very clearly about that scene. Um, it was about the summertime, like when farmers bring their peaches to the farmers market. And it was like a Sunday morning. And we were sitting in our dining room. So it's like Sunday, there's no rush. We're just sitting down, talking about just everything, like theories about on everything, our just thoughts. And I just felt that this moment is like so precious to me. I really having um amazing time. It's like a really beautiful moment. So I really had to make art about it. So that's how it turned out. And while I was working on it, I started to realize, oh, I really want to talk about family and home in my series of work. I think that's the part that I seriously decide on. Okay, I want to explore more of this idea. Uh, as an international person, so I born in relatively small community in South Korea and moved to US when I was 21. And it's been about 7 to 8 years I live here. Before I got married to my husband, the lack of community, lack of family has been always haunting me. It was a very haunting idea of like, this like loneliness. You're not part of, anybody in wherever you live. So uh, if you have some sort of a deficiency in something, you tend to like think about more and more and more, and it becomes something actually like bigger than what it was. So I think that was the first reason I really had to go through that subject matter with my work. And second reason was I was one of the best conversation I have with my husband is always talking about our differences, the different way of looking at things, and it is endless. It is endless list. And I am both me and him are realizing it's because of how differently we grew up. I'm Korean. My husband born in US and he lived in US for his entire life. So it's just it is so interesting to me how that little moment, that experience you had with your family and community affects so much of how this man look at the world. So I got the idea and I was like, okay, I want to explore this idea more with more people, right? So I started to ask questions to my friends if they want to interview with me. I think I should move on to the next slide and talk more about this process. So the first process of my art making is I, of course, if my friend says yes, they want to, and I go into their house and I ask them to, sit down wherever they feel most comfortable, but also has a good lighting for my painting's sake. And I put the camera somewhere in the corner and ask them very general question, something like, what do you think about family? What is home to you? Some of my friends seems like frustrated because it's too general. Okay, where do I start? And I think that's the part when this interesting story comes up, because everyone has different starting point in their story. So some starting from like where they can remember, like how they born, where they born, how they grew up. but some people starting off with what they have, like what's their families like right now. So for example, this family I visited, and then this image came up after I recorded all the video of the interview, and I bring it to the studio, and I watched the video over and over and over, and make a lot of screenshots of it, and make a collage out of it, and make a final image for my painting. So composition and all this stuff's like matters. And this is the studio space. The image that you're looking at is I did underpainting on just normal stretched canvas. Next, please. And then the next step is I have to think about the specific theme of this family. So there's when my interpretation get involved. For this family specifically, when I was visiting their house, it was around Christmas time, and they are always so good at decorating their house by seasons. I always got jealous, and I went in there. Of course, they have like two like Christmas trees, and I remember there's like a advent calendar on the wall, and the fireplace is decorated by like socks and stuff. It was very Christmassy, and then they have this wonderful daughter. And I think whenever there's like a kid in the family, Christmas become a little bit more magical and special. So I just decided, okay, this is gonna be a Christmassy theme painting. And I started to collect these fabrics from everywhere. Like before COVID, I travel to like local fabric store or thrift store to get the fabrics. Yeah, but now everything should be online. But anyway, I collect the fabric and make a design out of it, and decide whether I like in this way or not. And next, please. And then I sew them together. Of course, I have to take the canvas off from the stretcher bar and sew the design around the painting. And I kind of finish up in a style of quilt. So it's hard to see in the image. There's a bedding in as a second layer, and then there's a backing fabric. And I sew all those 3 layers together. And then I bring it back to the wall and finish up the painting. Next, please. So this is the finished image of the work. This is called Eve. One of my, this is the most recent painting that I made in 2021. Next, please. Okay, so this is another version. I interviewed this couple, and this one I tried to experiment with different sort of a fabric and how they work together. Obviously, the top part is a shirting that I got from the thrift store, and I just cut them out and then connect it together and see how it worked. And if you look at the sides, there's a denim, there's a silk, and also cotton fabric. And I kind of showing like batting a little bit on the sides as well. And it was very much playful because our interview was very playful too. So that's the one. And next, please. Okay, so this one is called Leaf Through. And this is a portrait of my friend. And she is an international artist like me. She born in Iran and moved to US, and she's a working artist right now in US. So just I really do admire her as a person. She is like the strongest woman I ever seen. And the reason I wanted to make this portrait of her was to showing her like power. Like I wish my decoration of fabric can show her strength, beauty in strengths and stuff like that. So this quilt, I think about how can my quilt become something like sort of a gesture of supporting, embracing, or empowering of who she is, because she's amazing. And I really, in relation to that sort of a gesture, I see that from Faith Ringgold's work. Next, please. So I didn't know about Faith Ringgold's story quilt. I was familiar with her painting. I seen it at MoMA years ago. And when I was struggling with technical issue with my quilts, one of my friends asked me, have you looked at her quilt? It looked really similar. So I looked at it and I'm like, oh, that's exactly what I want to do. She's so cool. And there are other works that I really do admire, but this work I really can relate to. So this is a permanent collection of St. Louis Art Museum, and now it's on view. You can see it up close, not too close, but up close at the museum. But at the same time, you can actually like zoom in the image on their website. And like most of the story quilts of Ringgold's, there are texts around her quilts, and that actually really gives another layer of narrative to the work, and also it really does empowers the subject that she painted. I wrote down some of the texts that I felt really I really liked. So one was she said Josephine Baker, Joe Baker's beauty is not from vulnerability, it is from her force and power. And she said physical beauty is shallow, that doesn't last, but Josephine's beauty is deeper than that. And she said beauty is freedom, and freedom lasts, but not without struggle. So I really felt she is celebrating and empowering her presence, her beauty with her quilt. And if you look up close to those quilts, it's amazing. Like flower patterns is really celebratory. It's really, celebrating the beauty of her. And I think that's what I hope, that's the gesture that I can create for the portraits that I make, because all those individuals that I paint are very valuable for me. So, and the next, please. About the empowerment. So this is a work called Portrait of Yu Gyeongja, made by her husband and daughter. This is a portrait of my mom. And as I am reaching to the age where she had me, and I'm like realizing more and more, I just can't understand how could she sacrifice so much? How could she be so selfless to dedicate to our family? So she should be. I just honestly thought like I really want to make a work about her, and she should be like sitting on the top of the world. And that was like my idea. And I asked my dad to send a picture of her, and they both are retired. And then my dad sent me a really sweet picture. She's sitting in the garden with her doggy. And I thought, "Ah, that's such a perfect picture." And her face was so calm. And I painted the portrait and then make this installation. A lot of you might not be familiar with this setting, but this is a Korean traditional sitting arrangement. Uh, so I will just give you the name for each part. The big mattress part is called Boryo, and that's where the subject sits. And those like cube shaped pillow is tanchim, and then a little bit elongated version is changchim. And then the sitting floor sitting pillow is called bangseok for the guest. So this is like a traditional sitting, but it wasn't for everybody. It was only for people who have power or for the royal family. Next, please. So this is like a front view. And I wish like my mom is sitting on where, you know, the power is. And I hope my installation really empowers her strength and, you know, her life. So it was almost like a shrine of my mom for me. Next, please. So I brought some of the images of like the actual setting. So this is what I inspired by. And next, please. So this is more like a palace setting. If you can see, there's like a far away where the kind of like wooden couch on it. There's a Poryo is sitting on, and there's like where king or queen royal family seats, and guests come in to the door and then greeting and stuff like that. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Song, for sharing about your practice. And if you have any more questions for Song, continue to add questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll address them at the end. I see a few have already built. And I would like to introduce our last speaker for this evening, Nena Okore, who's actually joining us all the way from Australia. And Nena Okore was born in Australia and raised in Nigeria. She earned her BA from the University of Nigeria in Nsukka and her MA and MFA at the University of Iowa. Okore is a professor at Chicago's North Park University. In her career as an artist, research teacher, she has focused on exploring processes that are connected to learning, artistic experiences, environmental awareness, and sustainable practices through participation. And thank you and welcome, Nena.
Thank you, Victoria. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you all for joining us. And I know that, I just feel very honored to be sitting with these spectacular artists who have such a beautiful repertoire of material practices and such a rich and empowering narrative behind the connections that they have to their identity as women and other and cross-generational experiences and influences. So I'm going to be presenting my work to you. And you can go to the next slide. Let me start from there. Okay, so I just want to say that a lot of the works that I'm presenting here are, from a span of 20 years. And so my practice is quite vast. And I've also worked with a lot of materials. So what I'm presenting to you in this panel discussion is work that has particularly been reflective of my interest in fiber art. And I think that some of the focus of the works that have been presented by other artists also has to do with fiber or connections to fiber and so on. And so I'm kind of continuing in that line. So I work with paper, I work with clay and different materials, but I just want to kind of highlight these particular ones that have to do with fiber. And to begin, I want to say that my processes have come from a long history of working with handcrafts and being exposed to that from an early age and fabricating things from the scratch. In my childhood years, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother and other women of essence in my life, and learned very much to work with my hands. And this is the way that I perceive the world. I perceive the world through making, through piecing together things. And it is from watching these women, both in the rural area in Nigeria and in my domestic spaces, that I've learned how things are put together, how to make and build and tear apart and bring it back together. And so that is sort of the mental and visual lens through which I perceive and make things in the world. I also want to acknowledge that the interest in fiber has a lot to do with my interest in the environment and the ties that I see having to do with women being the custodians of the planet and life in general. And symbolically, because our bodies are like a vessel through which life stems and through which life is produced, I do see a correlation between that and the earth, the planet, which also embodies this idea of nurturing, being a mother to all the living things and those kinds of connections. So for me, there's a lot of interconnections and strings of consciousness that kind of go between being a woman, working with our hands, working with the earth, being custodians of the earth, and so on. These back series that you see here basically illustrate the complexity of crafting that you see in most of my practice. And in this process, I use very painstaking material layered process to create these tree barks. And they're made from paper and other kinds of fiber like food matter, starch, moss, and jute. And what I'm really interested in here is thinking about how we're all sort of fibers and we're all interconnected as long as we're on this earth, and looking at sort of the biomaterial energies and those kinds of things in the natural world. And so these processes come together, through a lot of coalition and engagements with different processes and different materials. I bring the materials together. I find ways of breaking them down and reassembling them and rearticulating them using very strenuous and difficult types of craft making processes, and also painstaking, labor-intensive processes to put them together. And it's deeply satisfying to see them as they kind of return back to their natural origins. So it's interesting that there's also a correlation between the paper, which has been harvested from the natural environment, and then returning it back to the natural references from which they come. Next slide, please. And then with this piece here, it's called Flora. This is one of 3 in a series. And here I wanted to explore the diverse materiality of paper and fiber and push material possibilities. And the form not only comments on the ecological conditions of the materials that we expend in this world and we sort of like waste, but it also looks at the irony of taking something from nature and making something man-made, and then for me, returning it back to its original form. So I like this idea of, being the carer of the planet, trying to pick up after our bad habits and trying to create works that not only pay homage to the natural world, but also get us to think about, our role on Earth and what we're doing exactly with gathering and accumulating and tapping all our resources. And so the idea for me also goes to thinking about transience and ephemerality of materials. And when I think of flowers, especially, I'm thinking about the idea that a flower blossoms and then it wilts and it dies and life goes on, and it births, and in the process of in so doing also births new life, which ties back to women and the earth. And so these are some things that are crossing my consciousness as I'm working with these materials. Next slide. Now, after working with, in different directions, I'm always exploring and thinking about new ways of approaching my material practice. I stopped at some point working with the idea of piecing together things. And as I thought more about the process of regeneration and rebirth and the whole metamorphosis of life, of continual birthing and aging and dying, and even watching myself kind of go through that process, losing my dad at some point, aging myself and having children and watching my body change, I started thinking more about how materials kind of break down. And I began to adopt different processes that would enact that in the work. And so I started tearing the materials, tattering it, the fabric that I use, which is like a jute-based material, and then adding colors to that and trying to, represent the idea of life being beautiful, even when it's seemingly disappearing or dissipating. And so you can see in this fabric piece here that the piece looks wilted, it is sheer, it looks tattered and torn up. And those are some things that I find very interesting as symbolic references to the nature and essence of life. Next slide. And then part of what I do with the works is not just to engage people or viewers frontally. I'm also interested in having some kind of participatory elements where people are enshrouded in the work or enmeshed in it. So a lot of the works that I make sometimes would be large scale, encompassing immersive environments that invite the viewer to be a partaker of the experience, where they can walk into it, they can touch it, they can meander through the different holes. And so there's a lot of room for engagement and interaction. And those are things that I am particularly drawn to, having to engage with the tactile attributes and become one with the piece. So like can I have the next slide, please? Like the last installation, I do invite my viewers to, like I said, walk under, around the piece. And the display provides an interesting tension between the floor and the ceiling above. And I enjoy these kinds of references to architecture and shelter, which the work evokes. And in this installation, which towers over the audience, it forces the audience to shrink. There's actually a picture I have, but it's not, that's what I thought it was, that has participants within the work. And it's quite interesting to see the body relationships between the fiber and the piece. But again, you're really getting people to be introspective about the role that things around us, the materials around us, play in our lives. We sometimes get so centered in ourselves and don't think about how we are all contributing to being the fabric of the natural environment that we exist in. And so the next slide, please. Next slide, please. In this slide, I'm taking a slightly different direction, looking at the secularity of form as a metaphor for collective cosmic experience. Again, of recent, I've been so enthralled and fascinated with this whole idea of life regenerating, that birth has to happen and death is also equally important, that things have to die in order for new things to generate. And so I've been thinking about sort of a secular symbolism for that, and how that regenerative process of life is so important. And I'm interested in, expanding my sphere of understanding for the material and looking at distinct ways of creating texture, repetition, multiples, and so on and so forth. So in this work, I'm really not just exploring materially, but I'm also exploring it conceptually, trying to expand the field of understanding when it comes to regeneration of life. Next slide, please. Similarly here, at close observation, you would notice the same secular shapes that are kind of woven into the fabric. And I was interested here in looking for ways to expand my sort of wealth of material processes and avenues through which I can express this material. And so I was interested in distinct ways of creating textures, repetitions, and so on and so forth, and creating rich layers through whose attributes were not easy to decipher. So for one, in this piece, I didn't add color, which is so unlike me, because I like to have bold and bright colors that represent, that kind of draws the gaze of a viewer who's not interested. But I decided to kind of do away with the color here because I wanted to really bring people's attention to the materiality of the piece and have them really pay attention to what was going on within and to find secrets within it. In the next slide, this is a smaller sculpture, which is also something I do from time to time, a wall sculpture that consists of layers of petals fashioned from cheesecloth, string, and wire. And this creation reminds the viewer of nature's brilliance. It's not just for our fancy, but part of a larger system of cosmic balance and planetary order. Like many of my works, I'm interested in material meaning and intersections between the materiality of things and the habitual existence of those things as well. The question for me really is, how can we decenter ourselves from the conversation around the art we make? So a lot of times when we're thinking about art, thinking about the materials we're using, we put ourselves forward first. And not to say that there's anything wrong with that, but sometimes how can the work be bigger than that? How can it really talk to things that are happening in the world that are of essence? How can it give agency to other bigger and important values? So for me, it's about, and this is just a personal choice, it's about kind of moving back away and trying to bring a voice to the material itself and give it life and have it speak for other bigger issues. And then the next slide, please. And then in this piece, I'm exploring, it's called Changing Phases. I'm presenting an emergent floral stroke root system. And I'm seeking to remind the viewers that these materials are an extension of ourselves. And when we pay close enough attention to our materials or how we use them in our art making, we can learn more about the world through them, and we can try to be more tolerant. And I think where I'm going to with these kinds of philosophies is the idea that I'm very environmentally sensitive, in the sense that I want to think about how I'm using the natural resources, how they are informing what I do from day to day. So I have to actually step back from myself to think about the role that a material is playing. Like, okay, if I use this plastic bottle, how does it impact the world or the earth? And so I have to step back, and it's about being meditative. It's about thinking about what happens next. What is the life cycle that our actions impact upon the earth? So I think that there is an environmental ecological sensibility in many of these my works, and it may not resonate with everyone, but at least for me, it gives me a moment of pause to really think about the role that I play and how I kind of affect different materials, either to harm us more or to help nourish the earth. On the long run, the next slide is called On the Long Run. And in this piece, it encapsulates an idea that is poetic and speaks to longevity, and not only as a constructed idea, but thinking about longevity as something that compresses and contracts. It kind of expands and contracts, and thinking about the fact that nothing lasts forever, that nature has already started to take back what it has temporarily shared. So even as nature is giving, it's taking back. And so for me, when we think about the long run, it's like we're all here on a rat race, right? We are striving, we are trying to make the best of the life that we have on earth, but on the long run, it will still all come to an end, And I know it can be very dystopian in that sense, because we don't want to think about those kinds of things, those kinds of morbid ends to things. But for me, I think it's important to confront them, because it makes it easier for me to tackle life and feel comfortable and confident moving forward. And so the natural and subtle vibrant colors here offered in the piece seem to fade away a little bit. I play with color, trying to force the viewer to reckon with that idea that the flower was once very bright or blooming, and now everything is kind of like compressing and shrinking. The next slide, please. So I often splash a lot of vibrant colors, like I said, into my work to try to make sure that people are paying attention. And it's my hope that in so doing, that people really get into the material attributes, their fragility, their thing or spirit power, because I believe that every object that we lay hands on has so much energy in it. Even when Edna was talking about how she uses material, she just picks it up and suddenly there's so much life in it, and she feels the urge to use it in some fashion to bring about this idea. And so for me, that's exactly what I feel when I'm working with color or sort of materials. I want that work to be pulsating, to kind of really throw a lot of energy out into the viewer's space. The last slide, please. And so in this final slide, I try to capture the delicate essence of the planet. I reference the ever-changing, the volatile, the ephemeral, the transience of nature and earthly life. And I'm interested in manifestations of time in material. I'm interested in how time plays into the things that we do, and we have no control over it. Time makes provision for the old to die and the new to be born. And nature's metamorphosis is, without question, the most ingenious phenomenon on earth. And I think that whole essence of life is really entrenched within the symbolism of being a woman and the ties to the earth. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Nana, and thank you to all of our artists that presented this evening. It was truly an honor to hear from you all. I just sat and listened. It was amazing. And so I'm excited to ask you all questions, and I'm sure the audience is also excited to hear some of those answers and ask questions themselves. But I wanted to get us started by a few questions here. So though you each talked about fiber art for today's program, I know each of you are not restricted to one medium. With Song, you being a painter by training, and Nena, you working with a number of recycled materials, including paper, and Edna now also creating a number of public murals. I was wondering if you could each answer how fiber art ties into the overall body of your work. And it's not something you're restricted to, but can you see different trends in how you, in your creative process, that can kind of come from the fiber art and move to other media?
I can start off with the way that the fibers tie into other things that I do is the way the patterns lay out. Like I think of a big quilt, and then you putting different sections together, rectangles, squares, triangles, that type of thing. And so it all ties in with the way it's all interwoven together, whether it's something that's concrete, like a very firm sculpture, or soft like a quilt, or hard like a mosaic. it's still the pattern that's coming together to create that specific design.
Yeah, that's actually very true. I also, yes, I see myself as a butterfly who grabs at things around me, and as such, I'm constantly weaving together. I like that word you used as well, Edna, in your description, weaving together things and layering different parts together. Because in essence, we're all actually made up of fiber, right? We're fiber, and the things around us are fiber, and so. It's a way of keeping record. It's a way of using different strands to form ourselves and to answer questions. And so the question is actually more of not necessarily how fiber is tied to the art, but how it's not, right? Because everything is tied to fiber. And so I think that being in an organic world, we just harness materials. For me, it manifests in things that are related to nature, and how I kind of construct and deconstruct those materials in order to reveal those essence.
Yeah, I totally agree with that because, like, I think by taking my painting off from the wooden stretcher bar, my painting totally becomes a piece of fabric, piece of fiber, right? And it keeps more open, it becomes more flexible. And me adding, like, Nana say, like, constructing and this deconstructing, there's always like forgiveness in fiber work. That's what I'm learning. Even I make a mistake, even I made wrong decision, it always has room that I can change it and fix it. So I think I'm really obsessed with this like gesture of women, and I think that is like one of the gesture that I get from my mother figures in my family. They're always like very much supporting and forgiving and embracing, and I think especially from the characteristic of the fiber itself too, it's so warm and soft, and that kind of, yeah, gestures um, are what I'm like trying to connect with my work.
Thank you. And I know some of you talked about this during your presentation, but I was wondering if you could talk about it a bit more in detail. What are some of the influences behind your work, whether they be people or techniques?
So peoples are, there are like artists that I very much inspired by, and there are people um, that I met in just a regular basis. For the people, I think definitely those artists who were in 20th abstract art, abstract expressionism artists, women artists were my biggest inspiration, because it really changed my um, concept of how to make a painting. And especially Helen Frankenthaler, when I first saw her clip of like laying the fabric canvas on the ground, and she just like very gently pour her medium, and it's like dyeing this fabric, and then it's end up showing up in the wall as other painting. It just whole process was just I don't know, as a person who never learned about those things, there's another way of like making painting in very like softer gesture really inspired me. And for the people, I think when I was working at Joanne um, Fabrics, the fabric store, I met lots of customers, and most of customers there are women and mom or grandmas, and they all came there to get materials for their baby quilts for their grandchild or their family. And they come in June for Christmas kilt because it takes so much effort and time. And I met so many people who are doing that, and it just it is by itself the time consuming and effort is such a loving gesture. So yeah, they're my biggest inspiration.
My inspiration is people. people's feelings, what people say, what people don't say, what you can read in between the lines. Because when you're having a general conversation, you hear the tension in their voice or the joy in their voice. The things the injustices in life, that inspires me in a way of trying to find a way to speak out and to try to make a difference. So that's what happened with me.
And for me, I think that I draw on the work of Mary Giles, one of the artists in your fiber artists in your collection at the St. Louis Museum of Art. And the reason why she, I mean, among others, of course, but the reason why she attracted me so deeply was because I feel like I have a lot in common with her. Like, she was exposed to domestic craft by her grandmother early in her life. She has an affinity for the natural world, as I do. And she loves to explore different processes and surface textures. And her works are closely linked to the basket making tradition, which is also something that has enthralled me for many years. And there's a lot that she does that should basically resonate with me. And I think that I'm totally fascinated with the character of her work and the tactility that it possesses. But yeah, she is one of those artists that I think really I share a lot of visual sensibilities with.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I have a couple questions coming in from the audience. So for Nena, do you consider the shadows of your works as you're creating?
Oh, yes, indeed. It's very interesting. About 2017, I had a show at the Jenkins Johnson Gallery in San Francisco, and they had such amazing lighting in the space where I had these fiber pieces installed, and the shadows were just like thrown across the whole room, and it made the place look magical. And one woman actually walked in, and she came to me in tears, and she was like, she was so moved by the works because of how the shadows extended into the whole space. And for her, it really made the work come to life in a way that she hadn't seen before. And so I think that shadows are very important for me, and it helps to kind of create this beautiful overlap between reality and the work and sort of like other kinds of visual associations. So indeed, it is important. Thank you.
Another question for Edna, where is the best place to see your art in person?
I have a permanent piece that's at the St. Louis Art, I'm sorry, started to say the St. Louis Art Museum, but at the airport in Terminal 1, it was a deconstruction of a quilt that's translated into glass. So you can see that in Concourse A8. And then I have a lot of pieces that are on this, well, that are permanent pieces at SIU Edwardsville and online.
Thank you. And so I want to ask you another question, Edna. You're a third generation quilter. Can you share a bit more about how you learned to quilt and how your quilt making has changed over the years, and how that the techniques that your grandmother was using are different than what you're using now?
Okay, I didn't get a chance to really see anything that my grandmother made. Like I said, she passed when I was 2, but with my mom recycling, she recycled early with the clothing and things like that. But what I learned took it a different step from my mom, because my mom made clothing, bed cover. I wanted something to hang on the wall. I didn't want anyone to sleep under my quilt. And I certainly didn't want anyone, like if you put it on the things on the floor, I didn't want anybody walking on it, because that's a lot of work involved in everything. So I learned techniques from her, and then I added a spin or two of my own, just based on experimenting and just playing around with fabric.
Amazing. And what upcoming projects are you each working on right now? I know it's COVID, things are a little bit different, but I'd love to hear.
Mainly, I'm working at home with the art, with the mosaic. So that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, I'm currently working on developing a bio-friendly material called bioplastic, which I'm using to substitute a lot of my art materials. And so having to use more natural food-based kind of products has been something that I've been working on in recent times.
I'm trying to learn more skills about different type of quilt, something more complicated. So what I'm practicing on right now is a rosebud quilt block, and I'm trying to get into applique, which is I'm very terrified about it, but I think yeah, I'm learning on that. And about there's another work that I'm working on is during it was very rough year for everybody because of the COVID, and my sister-in-law is working as a nurse, and she shared her struggle as a nurse in the COVID time with her family, and they had a Facebook live, and I had all that recording, and I asked her if I can make a work about it. So that is my next project.
Wow, really exciting. A question for Nena. How do you choose your organic structures or your forms? Do you photograph them, things in the natural world? Do they come from your mind? How do you construct them?
They are typically imaginative ideas. I do sketches, obviously, but in the process of working with the materials, I tend to allow seed control to the material to do what it wants to do. So if I'm trying to create a flower that looks like this, but in the drying process or whatever, it decides to curve and be in a different odd shape, I kind of go with the flow and allow that to happen because it's important for me to have that engagement and conversation. So typically I would reference things that are of the natural world, but not necessarily in a figurative or illustrative way, more abstractly through drawings, and then kind of allow what happens happen.
Thank you. And one last question for Song. You in your presentation, you mentioned how you have been completing an interview process with your subjects before portraying them in your canvas quilt forms. Is there anyone that you are looking forward to interviewing, or is there a famous or celebrity figure that you would hope to interview for one of your projects?
Well, not right now, but if I can, of course, I'd love to. But most of things will be happen after COVID.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, big thank you to everyone that participated tonight. Loved hearing from Edna, Song, and Nena about their practice. It was really a wonderful experience just to hear and speak with you all. I'd also like to thank the Mary Strauss Women in the Arts Endowment for supporting this program. And please stay tuned on the St. Louis Art Museum's website for more programs during Women's History Month and virtual programs during this COVID period. Thank you all for tuning in tonight, and please do have a great evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Nice meeting everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.